Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Tonight, we turn our gaze away from the golden light of the high halls and look instead toward the east, beyond the reach of the sun, where the shadows of the world are born. Close your eyes, let the weight of the day drift away, and find yourself standing on the threshold of a place where even the gods fear to tread. We are journeying to the Iron Wood, a forest of iron-leaved trees and cold, stagnant mists, where the air is heavy with the scent of pine resin and ancient malice. Here, in the heart of Yarnvid, the seeds of the world's destruction were first planted. Here, we witness the birth of a legend that would one day swallow the sun and bring the gods to their knees. This is the beginning of the saga of Fenrir, the great wolf of chaos. To understand the wolf, we must first understand the environment that nurtured his ferocity. The Iron Wood is not a place of life as we know it. It is a primeval wilderness located in the furthest reaches of Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. In this wood, the trees are not made of soft wood and flowing sap. Their trunks are as hard as forged steel, and their leaves are sharp, metallic blades that clatter in the wind like the shields of an advancing army. There is no birdsong here, no gentle rustle of leaves, only the low, rhythmic groaning of the iron boughs and the distant, echoing howls of the wolves that call this darkness home. It is a realm of eternal twilight, where the gray mist never truly lifts, and the ground is covered in a carpet of black needles and frozen moss. In the center of this desolation lived a figure of immense power and mystery, the witch giantess Angerboda. Angerboda, whose name carries the weight of grief and sorrow, was the mother of monsters. She was an old giantess, a dweller in the Iron Wood, and a master of the dark arts that the Norse called cedar. She was not merely a creature of physical size, but a being of primordial consciousness, representing the uncultivated and destructive forces of nature that predated the arrival of the Aesir. She was the mistress of the wolves, and the sagas tell us that she raised a brood of monstrous offspring within the iron shadows. She was a figure of cold determination, her eyes reflecting the gray mists of her home, her hands stained with the juices of bitter herbs and the blood of sacrifices. It was into this dark sanctuary that Loki, the trickster, the shapeshifter, found his way. The union between Loki and Angerboda was not born of love or affection, but of a cosmic alignment of chaos. Loki, the son of the giant Farboti, and the goddess or giantess Laufey, was a god who walked between worlds, never truly belonging to the ordered sanctuary of Asgard, nor the wild chaos of Jotunheim. He was the catalyst of change, the bringer of both innovation and destruction. When he sought out Angerboda in the depths of the Iron Wood, he was seeking to forge a legacy that would challenge the very foundations of the universe. Together, they brought forth 3 children who would become the ultimate adversaries of the gods. The first was Jormungandr, the serpent whose coils would eventually encircle the entire world. The second was Hel, the pale and half-dead goddess who would rule over the realm of the inglorious dead. And the third, the eldest and most terrifying of them all, was Fenrir. When Fenrir was born, he was not yet the world-swallowing monster of the prophecies. He was a pup, small and gray, with eyes that burned with a strange intelligence-driven fire. But even in his infancy, there was something unsettling about him. He did not play as other wolves played. He watched. He observed the movements of the winds and the patterns of the iron leaves. He grew at a rate that defied the laws of biology. Every day his frame became larger, his muscles denser, and his teeth sharper. The milk of his mother was supplemented by the raw meat of the ironwood's denizens, and the pup soon became a yearling of staggering proportions. As he grew, so did the unease in the halls of Asgard. The gods, sitting on their high thrones, were not blind to the events in the east. Odin, the All-Father, who sacrificed his eye for a drink from Mimir's well, had seen the shadows lengthening. He had consulted the Volva, the wise seeresses of the past, and he had heard the whispers of the Voluspa. The prophecies were clear. The children of Loki and Angerboda would be the harbingers of Ragnarok. They would be the instruments of the gods' demise. Odin knew that he could not leave these monsters to grow unchecked in the darkness of the iron wood. He knew that the threat must be brought into the light, where it could be measured, monitored, and, perhaps, contained. And so, the decision was made to fetch the children of Loki to Asgard. A party of gods was dispatched, though the sagas do not detail the struggle of capturing such formidable beings. We can imagine the tension as the Aesir entered the metallic silence of the iron wood, their armor gleaming in the gray mist. They found Angerboda in her cavernous hall, and they claimed her offspring. Jormungandr was seized and cast into the deep ocean that surrounds all lands, where he began to grow until he bit his own tail. Hel was sent to the cold, misty realm of Niflheim, where Odin gave her authority over 9 worlds, specifically to manage those who died of old age or sickness. But Fenrir was different. The wolf was too powerful to be easily discarded, and perhaps there was a flicker of hope among the gods that he could be tamed, or at least kept under observation within their own walls. He was brought to Asgard, the celestial city of golden palaces and eternal green plains. Imagine the contrast: the gray, shaggy predator walking the rainbow bridge, Bifrost, his claws clicking against the crystalline structure. He was a piece of the wild, untamed wilderness brought into the heart of civilization. He was the shadow in the garden. In the beginning, the Aesir treated Fenrir with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He was allowed to roam the meadows of Asgard, a massive presence that loomed over the smaller deities. But as the months passed, the wolf's growth became a source of genuine terror. He was no longer a yearling. He was a mountain of fur and bone. When he breathed, the air around him grew cold. When he growled, the foundations of the palaces vibrated. He was an apex predator in a world that had forgotten the necessity of such things. Of all the gods, only one had the courage to approach the wolf. This was Tyr, the god of justice, war, and single-minded bravery. Tyr was a figure of iron resolve, his presence as steady as the North Star. While the other gods kept their distance, watching Fenrir from the safety of high balconies or the perimeter of the great halls, Tyr walked beside him. He was the only one who dared to feed the wolf. Every day, Tyr would carry large portions of raw meat to Fenrir, standing within reach of those massive, bone-crushing jaws. There was a strange, silent understanding between the god and the beast. Tyr did not fear the wolf, and Fenrir, in those early days, seemed to respect the god's lack of tremor. They were both warriors in their own right, one the defender of order, the other the embodiment of chaos. Tyr's role as the feeder of the wolf is crucial to the mythology, for it established a bond of trust that would later be used as a weapon. Tyr was the bridge between the Aesir's fear and Fenrir's burgeoning power. He was the one who saw the wolf not just as a monster, but as a living being with its own internal logic and dignity. However, the more Fenrir ate, the more he grew. And the more he grew, the more the prophecies began to weigh on the minds of the gods. They saw his teeth, which were like the swords of the giants. They saw his eyes, which held a depth of ancient, predatory wisdom that made their own divine intellects feel fragile. They realized that they were housing their own executioner. The meadows of Asgard, once a place of peace, were now the hunting grounds of a creature that belonged to the end of time. The atmosphere in Asgard shifted from cautious tolerance to mounting dread. The gods would gather in council at the well of Urd, beneath the branches of Yggdrasil, and their conversations always returned to the wolf. They spoke of his size, his strength, and the inevitability of the prophecies. They knew they could not kill him within the sacred precincts of Asgard, for to spill his blood there would be a sacrilege that would invite the very chaos they sought to avoid. The ground of Asgard was hallowed, and the death of such a significant being would stain the very fabric of their reality. Thus, the problem was not how to kill Fenrir, but how to bind him. How do you restrain a force of nature? How do you leash a storm? The gods began to contemplate the first of their great tests. They would use the wolf's own pride against him. They would frame the binding not as a prison, but as a challenge, a test of strength for the mightiest creature in existence. This was the birth of the first chain, lighting. But before we speak of the chains, we must linger a moment longer on the image of the young Fenrir in Asgard. Picture him standing on a high ridge at sunset, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the golden sky. He is a creature of immense beauty and terrifying potential. He is the son of Loki, the nephew of Odin, and the fosterling of Tyr. He is a part of the family of gods, yet he is forever apart from them. He is the reminder that even in the most ordered of worlds, there is a place for the wild, the dark, and the uncontrollable. He is the echo of the iron wood, growing louder with every passing day. The gods watched him, and in their watching, they revealed their own insecurities. They were the masters of the cosmos, the shapers of destiny. Yet they were afraid of a wolf. This fear was the first crack in the foundation of Asgard. It was the acknowledgement that their order was not absolute, that there were forces in the universe that could not be bargained with or understood. Fenrir was the physical manifestation of that realization. He was the living proof that the Golden Age was finite. As we conclude this first chapter of our journey, hold that image in your mind, the great wolf growing larger in the fading light, and the gods huddled in their palaces, beginning to forge the first of the bonds that would define their relationship for the rest of eternity. The seeds of chaos have been sown, and the ground is beginning to tremble. In the iron wood, the metallic leaves continue to clatter, a sound that carries across the realms to the ears of those who know how to listen. The mother Angerboda sits in her cave, her eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the day her son returns to finish what he started. And in Asgard, the smiths of the gods are stoking their fires, preparing to create the first link in a chain of events that will lead to the end of everything. But Fenrir is not yet the enemy. He is still the fosterling of Tyr. He is still the curious observer of the divine. He is a being caught between his nature and his environment, a creature whose destiny is being carved by the very people who fear him most. The story of his binding is not just a story of a wolf. It is a story of how fear can turn a neighbor into a monster, and how the attempt to prevent a prophecy can often be the very thing that brings it to fruition. So, let the air grow cold. Let the shadows lengthen. We are only just beginning to walk the path of the wolf. The journey ahead is long, and the chains we are about to see forged are made of more than just iron and magic. They are made of betrayal, of pride, and of the desperate desire to survive in a universe that is slowly, inevitably, moving toward the already written end. Rest now, for a moment, in the silence of the iron wood. Listen to the wind through the metallic branches. Can you hear it? The low, rhythmic breathing of a creature that is growing, even as you sleep. A creature that is waiting for the gods to make their first move. The saga of Fenrir is the saga of us all, the struggle between the order we build and the chaos that always, eventually, finds its way back home. As we prepare to witness the first of the great trials, remember that strength is not always found in the muscles or the teeth. Sometimes, the greatest strength is found in the ability to endure, to wait, and to grow in the darkness until the time is right to break the world. Fenrir is the master of that endurance. He is the shadow that waits. And the gods are about to learn that some shadows cannot be leashed, no matter how strong the iron or how cunning the magic. The first chain is being hammered into shape. The first challenge is being prepared. And the wolf is watching, his eyes burning with the fire of the iron wood, ready to show the Aesir that he is more than they ever imagined. This is the beginning of the end, and the end is a wolf named Fenrir. Let the night be still. Let the stars be cold. We will continue our journey through the shadows of the north, following the scent of the great predator as he moves toward his destiny. The path is marked with iron and ice, and the destination is a place where the sun no longer shines. But for now, let us remain in the quiet of the beginning, before the first link was forged, when the wolf was still a pup, and the world was still young. The echoes of the iron wood are fading, replaced by the rhythmic strike of hammers in the celestial forges. The gods are working, the wolf is growing, and the universe is holding its breath, waiting for the first test of strength. This is the silence before the storm, the peace before the bite. This is the story of Fenrir. The wolf's growth was not merely a physical phenomenon. It was a cosmic signal. As his shoulders widened and his legs lengthened, the boundaries between the realms seemed to thin. The giants in Jotunheim felt a surge of ancient power, a reminder that their kin was flourishing in the heart of the enemy's camp. The dwarves in the dark depths of the earth felt the vibrations of his footsteps, a rhythmic drumming that disrupted their delicate craftsmanship. And in Midgard, the realm of men, the winters grew slightly longer, the winds a bit sharper, as if the natural world was anticipating the arrival of a great cold. Fenrir himself seemed unaware of the cosmic weight he carried. He spent his days exploring the rugged cliffs of Asgard, leaping over chasms that would have terrified a mountain goat. He would stand at the edge of the world, looking down into the swirling mists of Ginnungagap, the primordial void from which all life emerged. Perhaps he felt a kinship with that void, a sense of belonging to the emptiness that existed before the gods carved order out of the chaos. His howls, once the yips of a pup, were now deep, resonant bellows that seemed to originate from the very center of the earth. They were not cries of hunger or pain. They were declarations of existence. The gods, hearing these howls, felt a tightening in their chests. Each sound was a reminder of their mortality. They were the immortal Aesir, the rulers of the 9 worlds, yet they were haunted by the sound of a predator. Odin, in particular, spent many nights in his high seat, Hlidskjalf, looking out across the worlds, searching for a way to alter the threads of fate. He saw the Norns at the root of Yggdrasil, weaving the tapestry of existence, and he saw the black thread of Fenrir woven deep into the pattern. He knew that to pull that thread would be to unravel the whole, yet to leave it was to accept his own destruction. It was this paradox that drove the gods to action. They could not kill the wolf, and they could not let him roam free. They needed a middle path, a way to neutralize the threat without violating the sanctity of their home. They turned to the concept of the holmgang, the ritual duel, but modified it into a test of craftsmanship versus raw power. They would present the wolf with a challenge he could not refuse, for Fenrir was a creature of pride, and to him, strength was the only metric of worth. They began to gather the strongest iron from the farthest corners of the realms. They took the metal from the hearts of mountains, and the ores from the beds of volcanic rivers. The smiths of the Aesir, masters of fire and form, worked day and night, their hammers creating a symphony of industry that drowned out the natural sounds of Asgard. They forged a chain of such thickness and weight that it took 12 gods just to lift it. They called this chain lading, which means to lead or to guide, a deceptive name for a bond intended to imprison. When lading was finished, it lay on the grass like a sleeping serpent, its links as thick as a man's torso, its surface polished to a mirror shine. The gods approached Fenrir, who was resting in the shade of a great oak tree. They spoke to him with feigned admiration, their voices smooth and persuasive. "Fenrir," they said, "we have seen your strength, and we have marveled at your growth. But we wonder, is your power truly as great as it appears? We have forged this chain, the strongest we have ever made. We wish to see if you can break it. If you can, your fame will spread through all the worlds, and even the giants will tremble at your name." Fenrir looked at the chain. He smelled the iron and the sweat of the gods who had forged it. He saw the anticipation in their eyes, the hidden fear masked by smiles. He knew, even then, that this was more than a game, but his pride was a living thing, as large as his body. He looked at his own limbs, at the corded muscle and the thick bone. He felt the fire of the iron wood burning in his heart. He did not fear the iron. He feared only the possibility of being seen as weak. He stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow over the gathered gods. He walked to the center of the meadow and allowed them to wrap the heavy links around his neck, his torso, and his legs. He did not resist. He waited until the gods had stepped back, until the silence had settled over Asgard like a shroud. Then he moved. He did not strain or struggle. He simply expanded. He drew a deep breath, filling his massive lungs with the air of the heavens, and then he flexed every muscle in his body at once. The sound was not a snap, but an explosion. The links of lading flew apart like dry twigs in a gale. Shards of iron whistled through the air, embedding themselves in the trunks of the trees and the walls of the nearby palaces. The gods flinched, covering their faces as the debris rained down around them. Fenrir stood in the center of the shattered chain, his eyes glowing with triumph. He shook himself, shedding the remaining scraps of metal as if they were nothing more than raindrops. He looked at the gods, and for a moment the roles were reversed. He was the one who was superior. He was the one who had proven his worth. The Aesir offered their congratulations, their voices thin and strained, but in their hearts the dread had only deepened. Lighting had failed. The strongest iron of the gods had been broken like thread. The wolf was stronger than they had feared, and his pride was now bolstered by a victory. They had intended to bind him, but they had only succeeded in proving to him that he was, indeed, the mightiest being in Asgard. The meadows were silent as the gods walked away, leaving Fenrir alone with his triumph. This was the first link in the chain of events that would lead to the end. The gods had made their first move, and they had lost. They had underestimated the son of Loki, and in doing so, they had set the stage for a conflict that would eventually consume them all. The seeds of chaos were no longer just seeds. They were growing, spreading their roots deep into the earth of Asgard. And the wolf was no longer just a fosterling. He was a challenger. The iron wood was far away, but its influence was everywhere. The metallic leaves were clattering in the wind, and the mother Angerboda was smiling in the dark. The first test was over, but the second was already being planned. The gods would not give up so easily. They would forge another chain, stronger and heavier than the first. They would call it Dromi, and they would hope that this time the iron would hold. But as we shall see, the strength of a wolf is not measured by the weight of his chains, but by the fire of his spirit. And that fire was burning brighter than ever. The failure of the first chain, lading, did more than just bruise the ego of the divine smiths. It sent a tremor through the very roots of Yggdrasil. The sound of those iron links shattering had been a bell tolling for the end of an age, though many of the Aesir tried to convince themselves it was merely a temporary setback. They looked at the shards of iron embedded in the earth and saw a puzzle to be solved. But Odin, the All-Father, saw something far more terrifying. He saw the confirmation of a truth he had tried to bury in the deepest recesses of his vast memory. The wolf was growing, not just in size, but in metaphysical weight. He was becoming a gravity well, pulling the destiny of the gods toward a singular, violent point in time. To understand the dread that now permeated the golden halls of Asgard, one must understand the burden of the All-Father. Odin was not merely a king. He was a seeker of wisdom, a god who had traded his eye and hung himself from the world tree for 9 nights to grasp the secrets of the runes. He was a man obsessed with the horizon. While the other gods feasted in Valhalla or practiced their martial arts on the plains of Idavol, Odin sat upon Hlidskjalf, his gaze piercing the veils of the 9 worlds, and everywhere he looked, the shadow of the wolf was lengthening. It was a shadow that did not follow the movement of the sun. It was a shadow that grew from within the earth itself. In the nights following the breaking of lading, Odin could not find rest. The air in his great hall, Valaskjalf, felt thin and cold. The laughter of the Einherjar, his elite warriors, sounded hollow, like the rattling of dry bones. He knew that the answers he sought were not to be found in the councils of the living. To understand the wolf, he had to speak with the dead. He had to descend to the threshold of Hell's realm and summon the spirit of a Volva, a seeress whose wisdom predated the gods themselves, one who had seen the beginning of the world and knew the exact shape of its end. The journey of Odin to the grave of the seeress is a narrative of profound isolation. He did not take his usual retinue of ravens, Hugin, and Munin, nor did he travel with the thunderous fanfare of a king. He rode alone on Gleipnir, his 8-legged steed, whose hooves made no sound as they moved across the bridge of the dead. He traveled north and down, into the misty valleys where the light of Asgard is a forgotten dream. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp earth and stagnant water. He reached the eastern gate of Hell's domain, where the grass is gray and the wind speaks in the voices of those who have been forgotten by time. There, at the base of a high burial mound, Odin performed the rites of necromancy. He sang the Galdr, the magic songs that pull at the threads of the spirit world. He carved runes into the cold stone, calling forth a consciousness that had been silent for eons. The earth began to groan, a low, rhythmic sound that matched the beating of Odin's own heart. Slowly, the mist began to coalesce into a figure, a woman of indeterminate age, her skin the color of ash, her eyes burning with the pale fire of the northern lights. This was the Volva, and she was not pleased to be disturbed. "Who is the man, to me unknown?" she spoke, her voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "Who has increased for me an irksome journey? I was snowed over with snow, and smitten with rain, and drenched with dew. Dead have I long been." Odin, disguised as a traveler named Vegtam, did not flinch. He pressed her for the truth he already knew, but needed to hear in the clarity of the dead. He asked of the high gods, of the fate of the sun. And finally, he asked of the wolf. The Volva's responses, captured in the stanzas of the Poetic Edda, specifically the Voluspa, are the blueprint of the Norse apocalypse. She spoke of the ironwood once more, but this time with more specific malice. She spoke of an old woman, the witch giantess Angerboda, sitting in that dark forest and bringing forth the brood of Fenrir. "Eastward sits the Old One in ironwood," she chanted, her voice rising with the weight of the prophecy. "And there feeds the brood of Fenrir. Of all these, one, in monster's guise, shall be the snatcher of the moon." She described how the wolf would gorge himself on the life force of men, staining the seats of the gods with red blood. She spoke of a time when the sun would turn black and the weather would become a weapon of the chaos giants. This was not a warning. It was a statement of fact. To the Volva, time was not a line, but a circle that was already closed. Fenrir's role was not a possibility. It was an essential component of the cosmic structure. He was the great dog who would break his bonds, the one whose hunger would eventually consume the All-Father himself. Odin returned to Asgard with this knowledge pressing against his mind like a leaden crown. He walked through the golden streets, and for the first time, the beauty of the city felt like a lie. He looked at the towering walls, the sparkling fountains, and the lush gardens, and all he could see were the ruins they would one day become. He saw the gods as they were, magnificent, powerful, and utterly doomed. And at the center of this impending doom was the wolf, still roaming the meadows, still growing, still being fed by the hand of Tyr. The relationship between Tyr and Fenrir during this period is a study in tragic duty. While the other gods avoided the wolf, treating him as a leper or a curse, Tyr remained constant. We must imagine the scenes in the gray dawn of Asgard, the god of justice carrying the carcasses of oxen to the edge of the wolf's territory. Fenrir, now so large that his head reached the eaves of the lower houses, would watch Tyr approach with a look that was no longer that of a pet. His eyes held a cold, analytical intelligence. He understood that he was being isolated. He felt the fear of the other gods, and it fed his pride as much as the meat fed his body. Tyr, however, did not show fear. He moved with the calm precision of a man who has accepted his fate. Perhaps he, too, had heard the echoes of the Volva's prophecy. Perhaps he knew that his hand, the hand that fed the beast, would eventually be the price of its containment. There is a profound silence in the myths regarding Tyr's thoughts, but his actions speak of a god who valued the stability of the worlds over his own physical wholeness. He was the only one who maintained a shred of the old ways, the time before the wolf was a monster, when he was just a child of the iron wood. But the rest of Asgard was a different story. The presence of Fenrir began to warp the social fabric of the Aesir. The atmosphere of curiosity had long since evaporated, replaced by a pervasive anxiety. The gods began to whisper in corners, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever Loki entered the room. Loki, the father of the beast, walked with a new kind of swagger, a dangerous glint in his eyes. He knew that his children were the keys to the future, and he enjoyed the discomfort they caused his divine peers. He was the architect of this tension, the one who had brought the wild into the sanctuary, and he watched the gods struggle with a grim satisfaction. The gods' fear manifested in an obsession with security. They began to reinforce the gates of Asgard, to practice their defenses, and to consult the runes with frantic regularity. But these were physical solutions to a spiritual problem. Fenrir was not just a physical threat. He was a symptom of the universe's inherent instability. He was the personification of entropy, the force that eventually breaks down all order. The more the gods tried to secure their world, the more they realized how fragile it truly was. Odin, burdened by the Volva's whispers, knew that a second attempt at binding must be made. He could not wait for the wolf to reach his full, world-ending potential. He called for the smiths once more, but this time he demanded a work of even greater magnitude. If iron could not hold the beast, then they would use a metal that was more than iron, a composite of the strongest substances known to the gods. They worked for months, using secrets of the forge that had been passed down from the primordial fires of Muspelheim. The result was Dromi. If lading had been a heavy chain, Dromi was a masterwork of engineering. Its links were not just thick, they were intricate, designed to tighten the more the wearer struggled. It was a chain that seemed to have a life of its own, humming with a low, metallic vibration. The gods were confident. They believed that no living thing, not even the son of Angerboda, could prevail against the weight of Dromi. They looked at the massive coil of metal and saw their salvation. But as they prepared to present Dromi to the wolf, the mood in Asgard was not one of triumph, but of desperation. They were no longer testing a pup. They were challenging a titan. Fenrir was now a creature of such size and power that his very presence seemed to distort the air around him. When he walked, the grass beneath his paws withered and turned black. When he slept, the vibrations of his snoring could be felt in the bedrock of Valhalla. He had become a mountain of fur, muscle, and malice. The gods approached him again, their smiles even more forced than before. They brought Dromi out into the meadow, and its shine was so bright it seemed to hurt the eyes. They spoke to him of fame, of the legends that would be written of the wolf who could break Dromi. They appealed to his pride, the one part of his nature that they felt they could still manipulate. Fenrir looked at the chain, and he looked at the gods. He saw the sweat on their brows and the slight tremor in their hands. He knew that they were terrified. And in that moment, Fenrir made a choice. He was not a mindless beast. He was a creature of immense intellectual capacity. He knew that if he broke this chain, he would be proving his superiority once and for all. He would be showing the gods that their craftsmanship, their order, and their magic were all inferior to his raw, primordial power. He wanted to see the look of absolute despair on their faces when the links of Dromi shattered. He allowed them to bind him once more. The process took hours, for the chain was so heavy and complex that it required the cooperation of dozens of gods. They wrapped the metal around him, layer upon layer, until he looked like a statue of iron in the center of the green field. The gods stepped back, their breath catching in their throats. This was the moment. If Dromi held, the prophecy might be averted. If it broke, Fenrir waited. He let the gods enjoy the silence for a few seconds. He felt the cold weight of Dromi against his skin, the way the links bit into his fur. He felt the magical tension within the metal, trying to find a weakness in his frame. Then he acted. This time the sound was not an explosion. It was the sound of the world tearing. Fenrir did not just flex. He roared. It was a roar that carried across the 9 worlds, a sound that reached the ears of his siblings in the ocean and the mistlands. He threw himself against the earth, his massive limbs working like pistons. The links of Dromi, the work of months, the hope of the gods, began to groan. They glowed with a dull heat as the friction of Fenrir's movement tested their structural integrity. And then, with a final violent heave, the chain gave way. It did not just snap, it disintegrated. Shards of Dromi flew through the air like missiles, some of them traveling so far that they landed in the human realm of Midgard, appearing to the mortals as shooting stars. Fenrir stood up, his breath coming in heavy, rhythmic clouds of steam. He was free. He was unbroken. And he was laughing. The laughter of the wolf is one of the most chilling sounds in Norse mythology. It was not a human sound, but a series of deep, guttural barks that seemed to mock the very idea of order. He looked at the gods, who were standing in stunned silence, and in his eyes they saw the end. They saw the fire of Ragnarok. They saw the death of Odin. They saw the darkness that would one day swallow everything they had built. Fenrir turned and walked away, his steps heavy and purposeful. He did not need to speak. His actions had said everything. He had broken the strongest thing the gods could make. He had proven that their iron was as fragile as glass. He had shown them that he was not a part of their world, but the thing that would eventually destroy it. The gods watched him go, and the meadows of Asgard felt suddenly small and vulnerable. The failure of Dromi was not just a technical failure. It was a psychological catastrophe. The Aesir realized that they had no more options. They had used the best materials, the best smiths, and the best magic, and it had been nothing. The wolf was beyond their reach. He was growing toward a destiny they could no longer influence. Odin, standing at the edge of the field, felt the weight of the Volva's words again. Eastward sits the Old One, and there feeds the brood of Fenrir. He realized that the iron wood was not just a place in Jotunheim. It was a state of mind. It was the realization that chaos is always stronger than order in the long run. He looked at Tyr, who was standing still, his gaze fixed on the wolf's retreating back. Tyr's face was unreadable, but his hand was resting on the hilt of his sword, a silent promise of the sacrifice to come. The atmosphere in Asgard became funereal. The golden light seemed to dim, as if the sun itself was beginning to lose heart. The gods retreated to their halls, but there was no comfort to be found. Every sound, every gust of wind, every flicker of a torch reminded them of the wolf. They were living in a fortress that was no longer safe. They were the rulers of a world that was already slipping through their fingers. In the nights that followed, Odin did not return to his throne. He walked the perimeter of Asgard, his mind working through the logic of the impossible. If iron could not hold the wolf, then they must use something that was not iron. If physical strength could not bind him, then they must use the strength of the invisible. He realized that the answer lay not in the heavy metals of the earth, but in the subtle paradoxes of existence. He needed something that appeared to be nothing, yet was stronger than everything. He thought of the dwarves, the masters of the deep earth, the ones who had forged Odin's own spear, Gungnir, and Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. They were creatures of craft and cunning, beings who understood the relationship between the physical and the metaphysical. If anyone could create a bond that could hold the wolf, it would be them. But the price would be steep, and the materials would be strange beyond imagination. The decision was made to send a messenger to Svartalfheim. This was Skirnir, the same messenger who would later travel to the home of the giants for the god Freyr. Skirnir was a man of quick wit and silver tongue, a traveler who could navigate the dark tunnels of the dwarf realm. Odin gave him instructions that were as cryptic as the prophecy itself. He did not ask for iron or steel. He asked for the impossible. But as the messenger departed, the wolf remained in Asgard, a living monument to the gods' failure. Fenrir was no longer just a predator. He was a constant, looming presence. He would sit on the high hills, watching the sun with a look of intense, focused longing. He seemed to be counting the days, waiting for the moment when his growth would be complete, and his hunger would be unleashed. He was the shadow that would not be moved, the wolf that would not be leashed. The whispers of the Volva had become the background noise of Asgard. The gods no longer spoke of the future. They spoke of the present and how to survive it. The loss of Lyding and Dromi had stripped them of their arrogance. They were now a people under siege, waiting for a miracle from the dark depths of the earth. They were waiting for Gleipnir. But even as they waited, the cosmic clock was ticking. The winters were growing colder, and the wolves Skjold and Hati were drawing closer to the sun and the moon. The great serpent Jormungandr was stirring in the deep ocean, his coils tightening around the world. The pieces of the end were being moved into place. And Fenrir, the center of it all, was growing. He was the son of Loki, the heir of chaos and the breaker of chains. He was the one who had seen the fear in the eyes of the All-Father and found it wanting. He was the shadow of the iron wood, and he was here to stay. The gods had made their first 2 moves, and the score was 2-0 in favor of the wolf. The third move would be the final one, a gamble of such magnitude that it would cost a god his hand, and the wolf his freedom for a time. But for now, let the silence settle over the golden city. Let the gods dream of iron and ice. The messenger is in the dark. The dwarves are at their forges, and the materials of the impossible are being gathered. The story of Fenrir is moving into its most tragic chapter, the chapter of the silken bond. And the world is holding its breath, waiting for the sound of a cat's footstep and the growth of a mountain's root. The whispers of the vulva remain, echoing in the cold mountain passes and the deep, lightless caves. They are a reminder that the gods are not the only masters of destiny. There is a power older than Odin, a logic deeper than the runes. It is the logic of the end, and its name is Fenrir. As the gray mist of the north curls around the halls of Asgard, imagine the wolf lying in the tall grass, his eyes fixed on the stars. He is not afraid. He is waiting. He knows that the gods are planning their next move, and he is ready for it. He has broken lighting, and he has pulverized Dromi. He is the unstoppable force, and the gods are desperately searching for an immovable object. The saga continues, following the scent of the great predator as he moves through the twilight of the gods. The path is narrow, and the stakes are the universe itself. But for now, in the quiet before the next test, let us remember the wolf as he was, a mountain of power, a child of chaos, and the living embodiment of the fear that haunts the hearts of the immortal. The whispers are growing louder, and the night is only just beginning. The vulva's words were like a slow poison, seeping into the consciousness of every deity. They began to see the wolf not just in the meadows, but in their dreams. He was the predator in the tall grass of their minds. Odin, sitting on his throne, could feel the phantom pressure of those massive jaws on his own throat. He understood that the struggle with Fenrir was not just a battle of strength, but a battle of will. To bind the wolf was to bind the end of the world. It was an act of supreme defiance against the inevitable. But defiance has a price. To fight fate, one must often become as cold and calculating as fate itself. The gods were moving away from their roles as protectors and toward their roles as jailers. They were willing to use deception, to break the very laws of justice they claimed to uphold in order to save themselves. And in doing so, they were proving the vulva right. They were creating the conditions for their own destruction. Fenrir, in his silent majesty, was the mirror in which the gods saw their own flaws. He was the raw, honest power that exposed their artifice. He was the wild that could not be tamed by civilization. And as the smiths in the dark forges of the dwarves began to work on the impossible bond, the wolf waited, his presence a silent challenge to the sun. The shadow was growing, and the golden age was fading into the gray twilight of the north. The air in Asgard had changed. It no longer carried the scent of eternal spring and blooming meadows, but was instead thick with the metallic tang of the forge and the heavy, oppressive odor of cold iron. The decision had been made. The prophecy had been heard, and the shadows had been measured. Now, the gods moved from contemplation to construction. They were no longer merely observers of the wolf's growth. They were the architects of his restraint. This was the era of the first test, the forging of lighting, a chain meant to prove that divine order could still hold the wild, even as the wild grew to encompass the horizon. Imagine the great forge of Asgard. It is a place of immense heat and rhythmic sound, located in the deep foundations of the celestial city. Here, the fires are fed by the breath of the mountain winds, and the anvils are made of stone that was cooled in the first waters of creation. The smiths of the Aesir, divine beings whose hands could shape the lightning and the frost, worked in a state of grim focus. They knew the stakes. They knew that this iron was not for a sword or a shield, but for a barrier against the end of time. The hammers fell with a persistence that echoed through the halls, a heartbeat of iron that drowned out the whispers of the volva. The iron used for lading was not common ore. The gods had sought out the veins of the earth that had been untouched by the light of the sun for 1,000 generations. They took the metal that had been pressurized by the weight of the mountains, iron that had learned the lesson of endurance from the very bedrock of the world. They melted it in the white-hot intensity of the forge, purifying it until it shone with a dull, bluish luster. As the links were formed, each one as thick as the trunk of a young oak, the smiths chanted songs of binding, weaving the concepts of weight and stillness into the very molecular structure of the metal. While the forges roared, Fenrir continued his existence in the meadows of Asgard. He was no longer a creature that could be ignored. He had become a landmark, a mountain of shaggy fur and corded muscle that moved with a predatory grace that defied his immense size. When he stood, he blotted out the light of the lower stars. When he sat, the earth beneath him seemed to bow under his weight. He watched the gods with a quiet, analytical focus. He saw the smoke rising from the forges, and he heard the rhythmic strike of the hammers. He knew they were working for him. He felt the attention of the Aesir like a physical heat, and it fed the pride that was beginning to define his consciousness. The wolf's intelligence was a sharp, jagged thing. He was the son of Loki, after all, and the cunning of his father was woven into his nature as tightly as his strength. He understood the fear of the gods, and he took a dark pleasure in it. To Fenrir, their fear was a tribute. It was the acknowledgement that he was the most significant thing in their world. He did not yet harbor the pure malice that would later drive him at Ragnarok. Instead, he felt the arrogance of the ultimate champion. He wanted to be tested. He wanted to see the gods exhaust their resources against his spirit, only to find him standing, unbroken and supreme. Tyr, the only god who still approached him, saw this change in the wolf. He saw the way Fenrir's eyes had hardened into amber stones of defiance. He still carried the meat, still walked within the range of those terrifying jaws, but the silence between them had become heavy with the weight of the inevitable. Tyr knew that the first test was coming, and he knew that it was a game of shadows. The gods were not being honest with the wolf, and the wolf was not being honest with the gods. It was a dance of deception, choreographed by the fear of the end. The day lading was finished. The sun hung low and red over the walls of Asgard. casting long, bloody shadows across the grass. The gods emerged from the forge, carrying the chain between them. It took 20 of the strongest Aesir to move the massive coil of iron. It rattled with a deep bass sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of those who heard it. They brought it to the center of the great meadow, where Fenrir was waiting. He was lying in the tall grass, his head resting on his paws, looking like a ridge of stone in the fading light. The gods gathered in a semicircle, keeping a safe distance. Their armor was polished, their spears were held upright, but their eyes were fixed on the wolf with a desperate intensity. Odin stepped forward, his blue cloak fluttering in the wind, his single eye reflecting the cold light of the iron. He spoke with a voice that was both commanding and coaxing, the voice of a king who is also a salesman. "Fenrir," Odin said, the name echoing across the plains. "We have marveled at your growth. We have spoken of your strength in the high halls, and we have wondered if there is anything in the 9 worlds that can match the power of your limbs. We have forged this chain, lading, the strongest bond we have ever created. We wish to see if your fame is well-founded. We wish to see if you can break it." Fenrir stood up, and the gods instinctively took a step back. He was so large now that he seemed to fill the entire horizon. He looked at the chain, sniffing the cold air that surrounded it. He felt the magical weight of the iron, the songs of binding that the smiths had woven into the links. He saw the way the gods were watching him, their breath held in their throats. He understood the trap. He knew that this was not a simple game of strength, but his pride was a fire that consumed his caution. To refuse the challenge would be to admit that he feared the iron, and Fenrir feared nothing. He looked at his own legs, at the massive paws that could crush boulders, at the muscles that rippled like waves under his fur. He felt the raw, primordial energy of the iron wood surging through his veins. He believed, with the absolute certainty of the apex predator, that no iron forged by the hands of gods could hold the spirit of the wild. He wanted to hear the sound of their hope shattering. "Bind me," Fenrir growled, the sound like a distant rockslide. "Let us see whose work is stronger, the iron of the Aesir or the blood of the wolf." The gods moved in quickly, their hands shaking slightly as they began to wrap the heavy links around Fenrir's torso and legs. They worked with a feverish energy, layer upon layer of iron, until the wolf was encased in a metallic shell. They fastened the final bolt, a massive piece of steel that required the strength of Thor to set in place. Then they stepped back, their faces pale and expectant. Fenrir stood in the center of the meadow, a statue of iron and shadow. He felt the cold pressure of the links against his fur, the way they restricted his movement, the way the magic tried to find a purchase in his spirit. He let the silence settle. He let the gods enjoy their moment of perceived victory. He looked up at the stars, which were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and he felt the immense, ancient rhythm of the universe. Then he moved. He did not struggle or thrash. He simply flexed. He drew a deep, slow breath, expanding his chest, and then he pushed outward with every ounce of his God-given strength. The sound was not a snap, but a catastrophic failure of the material. The links of lading did not just break, they exploded. Shards of iron whistled through the air with the force of arrows. Some of them struck the stones of the nearby palaces, leaving deep gouges in the golden walls. One shard flew past Odin's head, cutting a lock of his hair before embedding itself in the trunk of an ash tree. The gods flinched, some of them falling to their knees as the debris rained down around them. When the smoke and the dust cleared, Fenrir was standing in the center of a circle of broken iron. He shook his fur, shedding the remaining scraps of metal as if they were nothing more than dead leaves. He looked at the gods, and his eyes were glowing with a terrifying golden light. He did not need to speak. His freedom was the only statement he needed to make. The failure of lading was a moment of profound psychological weight for the Aesir. They had put their best craftsmanship, their strongest iron, and their most potent binding songs into that chain. They had believed it was enough, and the wolf had broken it in a single second, without even breaking a sweat. It was the realization that their physical power was finite, while Fenrir's strength seemed to be drawing from a source that was infinite. As Fenrir walked away, his steps heavy and confident, the gods remained in the meadow, looking at the ruins of their work. The meadow, once a place of beauty, was now a scrapyard of failed intentions. The iron shards were a reminder of their vulnerability. They began to realize that they were not just dealing with a wolf, but with a cosmic event. Fenrir was the physical manifestation of the end, and he was breaking their world link by link. Odin stood alone, his gaze fixed on the wolf's retreating back. He did not show the fear that the other gods felt, but his mind was already moving to the next move. He knew that lading had been a preliminary test, a way to gauge the depth of the threat. Now he knew the depth, and it was a bottomless abyss. He saw the fear in the eyes of his kin, and he knew that he must lead them through this darkness, even if the path led to their destruction. The smiths were called back to the forge that very night. There was no time for rest, no time for mourning the failure of lading. The fires were stoked even higher, and the hammers fell with even greater urgency. They would forge a second chain, one that would make lading look like a toy. They would use the lessons learned from the first failure to create a bond that was twice as thick and twice as strong. They would call it Dromi, and they would invest in it all the remaining hope of Asgard. But the atmosphere in the forge had changed. The confidence of the smiths was gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic energy. They were no longer creating, they were defending. Each link of Dromi was forged with the sweat of anxiety and the fear of the wolf's roar. They were trying to build a wall against the tide, and they could already feel the water rising. Fenrir, meanwhile, had reached a new level of self-awareness. The breaking of lading had been a revelation to him. He realized that the gods were not his masters. He realized that their laws and their order were secondary to his own existence. He spent his days in a state of watchful waiting, his presence in Asgard becoming even more oppressive. He was no longer just a resident. He was a conqueror in waiting. He would sit on the highest peaks, looking down at the golden city, and he would see not a home, but a target. The meadows of Asgard were silent during this time. The birds had stopped singing, and the winds seemed to hold their breath. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic drumming of the forge, a sound that Fenrir found increasingly amusing. He was the wolf who had broken the iron, and he was ready for whatever the gods would bring next. He knew that Dromi was being forged, and he welcomed it. He wanted to see how much more of their world he could shatter. In this chapter of the saga, we see the shift from the theoretical threat of the prophecy to the physical reality of the conflict. The breaking of Lyding was the first time the gods had directly challenged the wolf and lost. It was the beginning of the end of their arrogance. They were learning that the universe did not always obey the rules of the Aesir. There were forces that were older, darker, and more persistent than the light of Asgard. The iron of lading had been the best that the physical world could offer, and it had been found wanting. The gods were beginning to understand that to bind Fenrir, they would have to move beyond the physical. They would have to find materials that defied the logic of the senses. But that realization was still in the future. For now, they were still clinging to the hope of iron. They were still trying to solve the problem with the weight of the forge. As the fires of Svartalfheim and the hammers of Asgard continued their work, the wolf waited. He was the shadow that was growing toward the sun. He was the son of Loki, and he was the master of his own destiny. The story of Lading is a story of how we try to contain the things we fear with the tools of our own making, only to find that our tools are not enough. It is a story of the limits of strength and the power of the wild. Let the night be cold. Let the stars be distant. We are moving toward the second test, the forging of Dromi, and the stakes are rising with every strike of the hammer. The wolf is ready. The gods are desperate, and the iron is being tested for the last time. This is the saga of Fenrir, and the first chain has already been broken. As we linger on the image of the shattered lading, think of the effort that went into those links. Think of the songs, the sweat, and the magic. All of it was undone in a moment by a single flex of a wolf's muscle. It is a reminder that there is a power in the natural world that can never be fully domesticated or understood. Fenrir is the ultimate symbol of that power. He is the reminder that the gods are only gods because the wild allows them to be, and the wild was now asserting its dominance. The meadow was now a place of ruin, but the gods would return to it. They would bring Dromi, and they would try again. They were caught in a cycle of their own making, a cycle of challenge and failure that was drawing them closer to the end. The whispers of the vulva were no longer whispers. They were the soundtrack of their lives, and the wolf was the conductor of the orchestra. The iron was cooling in the forges of the second attempt. Dromi was taking shape. But even as the metal hardened, the gods could feel the fragility of their plan. They were building a cage for a creature that could walk through walls. They were trying to bind a spirit with a chain, and the spirit was laughing. The story of Lading is the story of our first encounter with the truly uncontrollable. It is the moment when we realize that our world is not as secure as we thought it was. It is the moment when the wolf breaks the chain, and we are left standing in the ruins, wondering what to do next. The gods of Asgard were in that moment, and their answer was to forge a bigger chain. It was a human answer, a flawed answer, and it was an answer that would lead to even greater humiliation. But for now, the wolf is free. The meadow is quiet. The iron is broken, and the saga continues, moving into the shadows of the second test. The air is growing colder, and the shadows are growing longer. The wolf is waiting, and the end is drawing near. The breaking of Lading had another, more subtle effect on the gods. It began to erode their sense of unity. Some argued that the wolf should be cast out immediately, regardless of the prophecy. Others argued that to do so would only accelerate the end. The council at the well of Urd was no longer a place of harmonious deliberation. It was a place of fractious debate and mounting fear. They were a people under pressure, and the pressure was causing the foundations of their society to crack. Only Tyr remained steadfast. He continued to feed the wolf, his movements as calm and deliberate as ever. He was the only one who seemed to understand that the struggle with Fenrir was not a battle to be won, but a process to be endured. He was the one who saw the wolf as a whole being, not just a threat to be neutralized. And in his steadfastness, he was the only one who maintained a sense of dignity in the face of the impending doom. Fenrir watched Tyr with a look that was almost like pity. He saw the god's devotion to a world that was already dying. He saw the way Tyr's hand never wavered, even when it was inches from his teeth. Perhaps, in some deep, dark corner of his consciousness, Fenrir felt a kinship with Tyr. They were both outsiders in their own way. One, a god of a law that was failing, the other a creature of a chaos that was succeeding. They were two poles of the same cosmic axis, moving toward a collision that would define the end of the age. As the work on Dromi neared completion, the gods began to prepare for the second ritual. They were more cautious this time, more secretive. They did not speak to Fenrir of the new chain. They let him hear the sounds of the forge and draw his own conclusions. They wanted him to feel the weight of their effort, to believe that they were truly challenging him. And Fenrir, in his arrogance, was only too happy to play along. The meadow was prepared once more. The grass had grown back over the scars of lading, but the atmosphere was still heavy with the memory of the explosion. The gods brought Dromi out, and it was a sight that would have made a giant weep with envy. It was twice as large as lading, its links intricately engraved with runes of binding and weight. It hummed with a low, magical energy that seemed to pull at the air itself. The gods gathered, and the ritual began again. But this time, the tension was different. It was no longer a game of curiosity. It was a desperate act of survival. They looked at the wolf, and they saw not a pet, but an adversary. And the wolf looked at the gods, and he saw not masters, but prey. This was the state of Asgard on the eve of the second test. The order of the Aesir was being tested by the chaos of the iron wood, and the iron of lighting had already failed. The world was moving toward the silken bond, toward the sacrifice of Tyr, and toward the final fire of Ragnarok. But for a brief moment, in the quiet of the meadow, there was only the god, the wolf, and the broken iron. The saga of Fenrir is the saga of the things we cannot control. It is the story of the wolf in the garden, the shadow on the sun, and the chain that will not hold. It is a reminder that even the gods have their limits, and that the wild will always find a way to break free. As we move into the next chapter, keep that image of the shattered lading in your mind. It is the first step on the long road to the end. The echoes of the forge are growing louder. Dromi is ready. The wolf is standing, and the universe is waiting. The second test is about to begin, and the iron of the gods is about to be tested for the last time. This is the story of Fenrir, and the end is closer than you think. Let the air be still. Let the mists of Jotunheim roll in. We are following the wolf into the darkness, and the path is marked with broken iron and divine fear. The journey continues, and the shadow is growing larger with every breath. The first test is over, but the war for the future has only just begun. Rest now, in the silence of the meadow, before the roar of the second chain begins. The shards of lading were still cooling in the dirt of Asgard when the forge fires were stoked to a white-hot intensity once again. The failure of the first iron was a bitter draught for the Aesir to swallow, but it did not yet lead to total despair. Instead, it gave birth to a frantic, almost obsessive industriousness. They believed, in their divine arrogance, that the problem was merely a matter of scale. If a thick chain had failed, then a chain twice as thick, twice as heavy, and twice as fortified with enchantments would surely prevail. They called this second attempt Dromi, a name that in the old tongue speaks of a fetter that truly restrains. They poured into its creation all the remaining confidence of the celestial smithy, turning their anxiety into a rhythmic, relentless hammering that echoed through the 9 worlds. While the smiths labored, the wolf did not remain static. Fenrir was growing at a rate that seemed to pull the very fabric of reality taut. He was no longer a creature that walked the earth. He was becoming a feature of the landscape. When he stood upon the hills of Asgard, his shadow stretched across entire valleys, plunging the homes of the lesser spirits into a premature and terrifying darkness. His coat, once the soft gray of a winter cloud, had become a coarse, bristling armor of charcoal and silver. Each hair was like a needle of obsidian, and his skin beneath was as tough as the hide of a prehistoric leviathan. His breathing had become a weather pattern of its own, a low-pressure system that brought cold mists and the scent of the grave whenever he exhaled. In the nights leading up to the second test, Fenrir spent much of his time staring at the stars. He watched Skoll and Hati, his kin, as they relentlessly pursued the sun and the moon through the celestial heights. He felt a sympathetic vibration in his own chest, a longing to join the hunt, to leap into the ether and bite the light out of the sky. He understood now that he was not just a wolf. He was a cosmic predator. He felt the weight of his father Loki's blood in his veins, the blood of a shapeshifter and a firebringer, and the weight of his mother Angerboda's blood, the blood of the iron-willed giants who existed before the first dawn. He was the synthesis of ancient chaos, and he was beginning to feel his own strength as a divine mandate. Tyr continued his daily ritual, but the atmosphere had grown brittle. When the god of justice approached with the meat, Fenrir no longer waited for the carcass to be dropped. He would snatch it from the air with a speed that made the gods on the ramparts blink in disbelief. The sound of his jaws closing was like the slamming of a heavy iron gate. Tyr would stand there, his face a mask of iron-gray hair and weathered skin, looking into the wolf's amber eyes. There was no longer any pretense of taming. They were 2 ancient forces acknowledging the coming storm. Tyr knew that the iron of Dromi was being hammered out in the depths of the city, and he knew that he was the one who would have to convince the wolf to step into the snare once more. The forging of Dromi took 3 times as long as lading. The gods gathered the rarest metals from the roots of the world, iron that had been infused with the salt of the primordial oceans and the carbon of dead stars. They used hammers that had been tempered in the blood of dragons and cooled in the winds of Niflheim. Every link was a masterpiece of geometry, designed to interlock in a way that distributed stress across the entire length of the bond. They carved runes of stillness, weight, and bondage into the metal, using a stylus made of diamond. When the chain was finally laid out on the floor of the smithy, it glowed with a faint, ominous purple light. It did not just exist, it asserted itself. It felt like a physical burden just to look upon it. The day of the second trial arrived with a heavy, leaden sky. There was no wind, and the birds of Asgard were silent, as if they were waiting for a signal. The gods emerged from the foundations of the city, a long procession of warriors and artisans carrying the massive weight of Dromi. It took 40 of the strongest Einherjar to drag the chain across the meadows. The sound of it moving over the grass was a deep metallic rasp, a sound that promised a permanent end to movement. They brought it to the great plain of Idavo, where the wolf was waiting. Fenrir was standing near the center of the plain, his head held high, his ears pricked. He watched the gods approach with an expression of cold, detached amusement. He had seen the effort they had put into this new iron. He had heard the frantic rhythm of their hammers for months. To the wolf, this was a tribute. It was an admission that he was the most powerful being they had ever encountered. His pride, already vast, had become a towering thing, a fortress of the ego that no iron could breach. He felt the Asmegan, the god's strength, within his own limbs, a reservoir of power that felt as deep as the void of Ginnungagap. The gods stopped 20 paces from the wolf. Odin stepped forward, his spear Gungnir held in his hand, though its tip was pointed toward the earth. He spoke with a voice that was practiced and smooth, yet there was a hairline fracture of fear hidden in its resonance. "Fenrir," the Allfather said, "we have seen you shatter lading as if it were a spider's web. Your fame is indeed great, and your strength is beyond what we imagined. But the smiths of Asgard have not been idle. They have created Dromi, a chain that we believe is truly worthy of your spirit. If you can break this bond, then your glory will be eternal. No being, god or giant, will ever dare to question your supremacy. Will you test yourself against the masterwork of the Aesir?" Fenrir looked at Dromi. He saw the intricate runes, the glowing links, and the sheer, overwhelming mass of the iron. He felt the magic emanating from it, a cold, grasping energy that sought to stifle the fire in his heart. For a brief moment, a flicker of caution moved through his mind. He was no fool. He understood that the gods were desperate. He knew that each time they failed, they would return with something more dangerous. But then he looked at the gods themselves. He saw the sweat on their brows, the way they gripped their weapons too tightly, and the way they avoided his gaze. He saw their weakness, and it emboldened him. He believed that his strength was a rising tide, a force that would always exceed whatever barrier was placed in its path. To refuse would be to admit that the gods had found his limit. It would be to acknowledge that he was a prisoner of their craftsmanship. He wanted to see their hope turn to ash. He wanted to hear the sound of Dromi's runes screaming as they were torn apart. "Wrap it around me," Fenrir replied, his voice a low vibration that shook the very air. "Let us see if the iron of the gods has learned anything from its last humiliation." The gods moved in, their movements quick and nervous. They draped the links of Dromi over Fenrir's massive shoulders, weaving the metal between his legs and around his neck. It took nearly the entire afternoon to secure the wolf. When they were finished, Fenrir was a mountain of iron. The chain was so heavy that it began to sink into the soft earth of the meadow, creating a shallow crater around his paws. The gods stepped back, moving toward the edge of the plain, their hearts pounding in the silence. Fenrir stood perfectly still. He felt the immense pressure of the metal, the way it tried to pin him to the bedrock of Asgard. He felt the runes beginning to activate, their cold light intensifying as they sought to drain the heat from his muscles. The weight was staggering, 1,000 times greater than lading. For a moment, even the wolf wondered if he had overreached. The air in his lungs felt restricted, and the iron seemed to be growing heavier with every passing second, as if it were drawing mass from the earth itself. But then, he reached deep into the center of his being. He found the memory of the iron wood, the cold mists, and the raw, unrefined power of his mother Angerboda. He found the chaotic spark of his father Loki. He summoned the primordial energy that predated the gods, the strength of the giants and the fire of the void. He began to grow. It was not a physical growth in size, but an expansion of presence. He flexed his shoulders, and the ground beneath him cracked, long fissures snaking outward across the meadow. He drew a breath that sounded like a gale blowing through a canyon. He felt the links of Dromi tightening, the runes flaring with a blinding violet light as they fought to hold the expansion. The metal began to groan, a high-pitched, metallic scream that echoed through the palaces of Asgard. Fenrir roared. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated defiance, a sound that carried the weight of the end of the world. He threw himself forward, his massive muscles bunching and rippling with a force that defied the laws of physics. The earth of Idavol heaved, stone pillars in the distance toppling as the shockwave of his effort moved through the crust of the realm. The links of Dromi held for a heartbeat, then another. The gods watched, their faces pale, their hope flaring for a brief, agonizing second. "It holds," someone whispered. But it did not hold. The sound was not an explosion this time. It was a shattering. The magical tension within Dromi had become so great that when the metal finally failed, it did not just break, it turned into dust. A massive cloud of iron filings and pulverized stone erupted into the air, obscuring the wolf in a gray metallic mist. Shards of the chain that did not disintegrate flew across Asgard with the speed of lightning. One fragment struck the high balcony of Gladsheim, shattering the marble railing. Another flew over the walls of the city and vanished into the void beyond. When the mist cleared, Fenrir was standing in the center of a scorched and broken field. He was panting, his tongue lolling from his mouth, but he was free. The iron of Dromi was gone, reduced to a fine grit that coated his fur and the ground around him. He shook himself, and a cloud of iron dust rose from his coat, sparkling in the dim light of the evening. He looked at the gods, and his eyes held a look of absolute, terrifying triumph. The silence that followed was the most profound silence Asgard had ever known. It was the silence of total defeat. The Aesir looked at the empty space where Dromi had been, and they felt their own hearts grow cold. They had used the best of their materials, the deepest of their magic, and the greatest of their strength, and it had been brushed aside like a cobweb. They realized in that moment that they were not the masters of their own fate. They were merely spectators at the beginning of their own end. Odin stood as still as a statue, his single eye fixed on the wolf. He did not speak, for there were no words that could bridge the gap between their order and this chaos. He felt the weight of the runes in his mind, and for the first time, they felt like toys. He looked at the wolf, and he saw the abyss. He saw the jaws that would one day close around him, and he knew that no physical barrier would ever stop them. The gods began to retreat, walking slowly and quietly back toward their halls. There was no discussion, no council, no plan. They moved like ghosts in their own city. The breaking of Dromi had stripped them of their dignity. They were no longer the rulers of the cosmos. They were survivors waiting for a catastrophe. Fenrir remained in the meadow, his silhouette massive against the darkening sky. He did not chase them. He did not need to. He knew that he had won. He knew that he was the strongest thing in the universe. He spent the night howling at the stars, a sound of such loneliness and power that even the giants in the frozen wastes of Jotunheim paused to listen. The howls were a declaration of war, a signal to the shadows that the time of the wolf was drawing near. The breaking of Dromi marked the end of the age of iron. The gods realized that if they were to bind the wolf, they could not use the substances of the earth. They could not use the metals of the forge or the strength of their own hands. They had to look elsewhere. They had to look into the impossible. They had to find materials that existed only in the intersections of the world, in the things that were and were not. But as the messenger was prepared for the journey to the realm of the dwarves, the atmosphere in Asgard remained heavy with the scent of the broken chain. The meadows of Idavol were scarred, a permanent reminder of the wolf's power. The gods could clean the dust from their palaces, but they could not clean the fear from their souls. They were living in the shadow of a predator that was still growing, still waiting, and still laughing at their chains. This second failure was the catalyst for the ultimate deception. It was the moment the gods realized that justice and honor would not save them. To bind Fenrir, they would have to sacrifice their own integrity. They would have to use the wolf's trust against him. They would have to lure him into a trap that had no physical exit, a cage built of paradoxes and lies. And they would have to find a god who was willing to lose everything to close the gate. The story of Dromi is a story of the limits of the physical world. It is a reminder that there are forces in the universe that cannot be measured by weight or thickness. It is the story of how our greatest efforts can sometimes be our most humiliating failures, and how the things we try to suppress only grow stronger in the darkness of their confinement. Fenrir was the proof of that truth. Every link of Dromi that he shattered only made him more certain of his own divinity. As we conclude this chapter, imagine the wolf standing in the ruins of the meadow, the iron dust falling from his fur like gray snow. He is the master of the field. He is the breaker of Dromi, and he is the shadow that will eventually swallow the sun. The gods are retreating into the darkness of their own councils, and the dwarves are stoking the fires of a different kind of forge. The era of the impossible is beginning. Let the air grow colder. Let the stars go out one by one. We are moving toward the creation of Gleipnir, the silken bond that would finally do what iron could not. But the cost of that bond would be the hand of a god and the honor of a world. The saga of Fenrir is moving into its most tragic phase, where the line between hero and monster begins to blur, and the price of safety is revealed to be more than anyone can afford. The meadows of Asgard are waiting. The wolf is waiting. And the end is drawing closer with every beat of the divine heart. The iron has failed, and the magic of the deep earth is all that remains. Listen to the silence of the north, for in that silence the impossible is being woven. The story of the second test is over, but the final binding is just over the horizon. As the gods retreated, Loki watched them from the shadows. He did not speak, but his smile was a jagged thing, reflecting the broken links of Dromi. He knew that his son was the mirror of the Aesir's fear. He saw the way the golden age was tarnishing, the way the light of Asgard was beginning to flicker. He was the one who had brought the chaos into the garden, and he was watching the garden die with a grim, intellectual satisfaction. He was the father of the wolf, and he was the architect of the end. Fenrir, meanwhile, lay down in the center of the broken field. He did not sleep. He watched the horizon, waiting for the gods to return. He knew they would come again. He knew they had more tricks, more magic, and more fear. He welcomed it. He was a creature born of struggle, and he found his meaning in the breaking of bonds. He was the wolf who could not be leashed, and he was ready to show the universe that the end was not a prophecy, but a physical reality. The winds of Jotunheim began to blow across the plains, carrying the scent of iron and ice. The shadow of the wolf grew until it touched the walls of Valhalla. The era of Dromi was over, and the era of the silken bond was about to begin. The universe was holding its breath, waiting for the sound of a cat's footfall and the roots of a mountain. The impossible was coming, and the wolf was waiting to devour it. The echoes of Dromi's destruction had barely faded from the mountain peaks of Asgard when a heavy, stagnant silence settled over the halls of the gods. It was the silence of a people who had exhausted their understanding of the world. The Aesir had always defined themselves by their mastery over the physical, their ability to forge the hardest iron, to build the highest walls, and to wield the heaviest hammers. But Fenrir, the great wolf, had proven that the physical world has limits. He had shown them that strength, when grown to a cosmic scale, can simply ignore the laws of metallurgy and weight. The shattered links of Dromi, now nothing more than gray dust on the meadow, were a testament to the end of the age of iron. If the gods were to survive, they had to move beyond the forge. They had to move into the realm of the impossible. Odin, the All-Father, sat upon his high throne, Hlidskjalf, his one eye fixed on the horizon where the shadows of Jotunheim lay like a bruise. He understood better than any of his kin that they were no longer fighting a wolf. They were fighting a principle of existence. Fenrir was entropy. Fenrir was the inevitable return to the void. To bind him, they needed something that was not made of matter, for matter had already failed. They needed a bond made of essence, of paradox, and of the things that exist only in the peripheral vision of the universe. Odin looked down into the deep places of the earth, far beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, to the realm of Svartalfheim. There, in the lightless caverns and the subterranean workshops, lived the masters of the subtle arts, the dwarves. The dwarves, or the black elves, as the sagas sometimes call them, were not creatures of beauty, but they were the supreme architects of function. They understood the hidden properties of the world, the way a sound could be turned into a stone, or a thought into a blade. They had already provided the gods with their greatest treasures: Odin's spear that never misses, Thor's hammer that always returns, and the golden hair of Sif that grows like real grain. To them, the physical and the metaphysical were merely different sides of the same coin. Odin summoned Skirnir, the swift and clever messenger, and gave him a mission that sounded like a riddle. "Go to the depths of Svartalfheim," Odin commanded, his voice a low vibration in the quiet hall. "Find the sons of Ivaldi, or the master smiths of the deep. Tell them that the iron of the gods is broken. Tell them that the wolf is growing. Tell them we require a bond that is thin as silk, yet stronger than the bedrock of the world. Ask them to forge Gleipnir." Skirnir's journey into the earth was a descent into a world of sensory overload. He moved away from the golden light of Asgard, through the rugged mountain passes of Midgard, and down into the yawning chasms that led to the underworld. The air grew thick and humid, smelling of sulfur, ancient grease, and the cold, damp scent of deep earth stone. As he moved deeper, the silence of the surface was replaced by the rhythmic drumming of 1,000 tiny hammers, a sound that seemed to originate from the heart of the planet itself. There were no torches here. The way was lit by the glowing veins of precious ores and the bioluminescence of fungi that grew on the damp cave walls. When Skirnir reached the central forge of the dwarves, he found himself in a cathedral of shadow and flame. Huge bellows, worked by unseen hands, groaned as they stoked fires that burned with an unnatural violet hue. The master smiths stood around a central anvil that was carved from a single block of obsidian. They were small, gnarled figures, with skin like weathered bark, and eyes that held the spark of ancient intelligence. They listened to Skirnir's request without surprise. To the dwarves, the gods' failure with iron was expected. They knew that the Aesir relied too much on the obvious. "We can make this bond," the master smith replied, his voice like the rattling of dry pebbles. "But it will not be hammered. It will be woven. And the materials we require are not to be found in your mines or your forests. We require the shadows of the world's anomalies. We require the things that are, yet are not." The dwarves then began the collection of the 6 legendary ingredients of Gleipnir. These were not physical substances, but metaphysical properties that the dwarves harvested from the fabric of reality. Each ingredient was a paradox, a thing that was taken out of the world to be woven into the bond, which is why, as the Prose Edda notes, these things no longer exist as they once did. The first ingredient was the sound of a cat's footfall. The dwarves went to the places where the great mountain cats moved in the silence of the night. They watched as the feline's paws touched the stones without making a single vibration. They captured that absence of sound, that perfect stealth, and turned it into a thread. This is why, the myths tell us, a cat's movement is now completely silent. The sound was stolen for the binding of the wolf. The second ingredient was the beard of a woman. In the ancient logic of the North, the beard was a symbol of masculinity and outward power. By taking the potential for a woman to grow a beard, the dwarves were capturing the essence of the anomaly, the thing that defies the expected order. They wove this hidden, suppressed masculinity into the bond, giving it a strength that was not visible to the eye. The third ingredient was the roots of a mountain. To the eye, a mountain seems to sit upon the earth, but the dwarves knew that for a mountain to stand against the winds and the ages, it must have roots that reach into the very center of the world. They reached deep beneath the stone and extracted the concept of that stability, that immovable permanence. This is why mountains now appear to be rootless. Their anchoring essence was taken to ensure the wolf would never move again. The fourth ingredient was the sinews of a bear. The bear was the symbol of raw, untamed physical power, the berserker energy of the forest. The dwarves did not take the bear's flesh, but the concept of its tensile strength, the way a bear's muscle can pull apart a tree or crush a foe. They took this instinctual power and refined it into a gossamer thin line. The fifth ingredient was the breath of a fish. In the deep, cold waters of the ocean, the fish move in a world without air. Yet they breathe. They exist in a state of constant, fluid survival. The dwarves captured the mystery of that life support, the silent respiration of the depths. This is why fish now seem to have no breath as land dwellers understand it. That essence was used to give Gleipnir its flexibility and its lifelike persistence. The sixth and final ingredient was the spittle of a bird. A bird is a creature of the air, of fragility and light. Its spittle is a substance of no weight, a fleeting moisture. But the dwarves knew that the most fragile things can be the most enduring when turned into magic. They took the moisture of the sky dwellers and used it as the adhesive that bound all the other paradoxes together. For many days and nights, the dwarves worked in their violet-lit forge. They did not use hammers or heat as the gods did. They used chants, intricate weaving patterns, and the subtle pressure of their own divine will. They took these 6 impossible things and spun them into a cord. As they worked, the air in the cavern grew thin and cold, as if the reality of Svartalfheim was being stretched to the breaking point. The sound of their work was not the clang of metal, but a low, rhythmic hum, like the sound of 1,000 bees or the vibration of a distant storm. When Gleipnir was finished, it was not an imposing sight. It was not a heavy chain of iron like Lyding or a massive fetter like Dromi. It was a ribbon. It was as thin as a silk cord, as soft as the fur on a rabbit's ear, and as smooth as a polished gemstone. It felt almost weightless in the hand. It was beautiful, delicate, and seemingly fragile. But Skirnir, when he touched it, felt a cold shock move up his arm. He felt a weight that was not physical, but existential. He felt the gravity of 100 mountains and the silence of 1,000 graves. The master smith handed the ribbon to Skirnir with a grim smile. "Take this to the Aesir," he said. "Tell them that iron has failed, but paradox will hold. Tell them that this ribbon is made of the things that the wolf cannot fight, for he cannot bite a sound, and he cannot crush a root that is already gone. This is Gleipnir. It is the end of his freedom." Skirnir ascended from the depths, carrying the light ribbon in a small wooden box. As he moved back toward the world of light, the silence of the mountains felt different. The air of Midgard felt thinner. It was as if the world had been made slightly less real by the removal of those 6 ingredients. The cat moved more silently in the shadows. The mountain stood more precariously on the earth. The price of the bond was already being paid by the natural world. When Skirnir returned to Asgard, the gods gathered in the great hall of Gladsheim. They looked at the ribbon with a mixture of skepticism and hope. To the eyes of Thor, who valued the weight of his hammer, the ribbon looked like a toy. To the eyes of Freya, it looked like a garment. But Odin, the seeker of wisdom, saw it for what it truly was. He saw the shimmering, spectral energy of the ingredients. He saw the way the ribbon seemed to absorb the light around it. He understood that this was the immovable object they had been searching for. "The dwarves have done their work well," Odin whispered, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "They have provided us with a cage built of shadows. Now, we must find the courage to use it. We must find the strength to be as deceptive as the iron was honest." The atmosphere in Asgard shifted from the frantic energy of the forge to the cold, calculated tension of the trap. They knew that Fenrir would not accept this ribbon as a test of strength. He was too intelligent for that. After breaking lading and dromi, he would see a silken cord as an insult or a snare. They had to lure him to a place of isolation, a place where his power would be at a disadvantage. They chose the island of Lyngvi, located in the middle of the lake Amsvartnir. The name Amsvartnir means pitch black, and the island was a jagged shard of rock surrounded by dark, churning waters. It was a place of desolation, far from the hallowed ground of Asgard. But the most difficult part of the plan was not the location. It was the deception. They needed the wolf to trust them one last time. They needed someone to stand beside him, to offer their own body as a guarantee of the god's honesty. They looked at Tyr. The god of justice stood in the center of the hall, his face a mask of iron-gray hair and weathered skin. He knew what they were asking. He knew the prophecy. He knew that the wolf's jaws would eventually close, and he knew that someone's hand would have to be the price of the world's safety. Tyr did not hesitate. He had spent months feeding the wolf, building a bond that was the only thing resembling love in the predator's life. He was the only one Fenrir trusted. To use that trust to destroy the wolf was a stain on Tyr's honor. But he was a god who understood that justice sometimes requires a sacrifice that is beyond the law. He would be the one to lead the wolf to the island. He would be the one to offer his hand as a pledge. In this chapter of the saga, we see the transition from the physical to the spiritual. The forging of Gleipnir is the moment the gods acknowledge that they cannot rule by force alone. They must use the subtle, the invisible, and the impossible. They must move into the shadows of the dwarves' wisdom. But as they prepare to depart for the island of Lyngvi, the weight of their choice is palpable. They are about to commit a cosmic betrayal, and the consequences will ripple through the ages until the final fire of Ragnarok. The wolf, meanwhile, remained in the meadows of Asgard, unaware of the silken death that was approaching. He felt his power reaching its peak. He felt the earth trembling beneath his paws. He was ready for the god's third attempt. He expected more iron. He expected more weight. He expected a challenge he could shatter with a roar. He did not expect a ribbon. He did not expect the silence of a cat's footfall. As the gods boarded their ships for the journey to the lake Amsvartnir, the sun began to set, casting a long, bloody light over the world. The winds of the north were picking up, carrying the scent of salt and impending doom. The story of Fenrir was entering its final, most tragic phase. The iron was broken, The silk was woven, and the island was waiting. The forging of Gleipnir is a reminder that the most powerful things in the universe are often the ones we cannot see. It is the sound of the silence, the breath of the deep, and the roots of the hidden. It is the power of paradox. The gods were gambling their future on a string, and the wolf was waiting to show them that even shadows can have teeth. Let the night be deep. Let the fires of Svartalfheim burn in your memory. We are moving toward the island of Lyngvi, where the sacrifice of Tyr will be made, and the wolf will be bound for an eternity. The path is narrow, and the cost is high. But the saga must continue, for the end is already written in the stars, and the wolf is growing toward his destiny. The silence of the dwarves' forge remains, a haunting melody that echoes in the deep places of the world. It is the sound of the impossible being made real, and as the gods approach the wolf with the silken ribbon hidden in their hands, the universe holds its breath. The third test is not a test of strength, but a test of soul. And the soul of Asgard is about to be weighed against the hunger of the wolf. Gleipnir, thin as a breath and strong as fate, is ready. The gods are ready. And Fenrir, the son of chaos, is standing on the shore, his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the end to begin. This is the story of the impossible bond, and the price of the world is a hand of a god. As we conclude this chapter, imagine the ribbon lying in its wooden box. It looks like nothing. It looks like a gift for a child. But it is the most dangerous object in the 9 worlds. It is the leash of the end times. And the wolf, in his magnificent arrogance, is about to learn that the things you cannot see are the things that will eventually hold you. The age of iron is over. The age of silk has begun. The journey to the island of Lyngvi is a solemn one. The gods row in silence, their eyes fixed on the wolf, who follows them in a separate vessel, or perhaps leaps from rock to rock through the dark water. The atmosphere is that of a funeral procession. They are going to bury their enemy, but they are also going to bury their own honor. And Tyr, standing at the prow of the lead ship, looks at his right hand, the hand that has fed the wolf for so long, and he knows that it is the last time he will see it whole. The shadows of the iron wood are here, and they are weaving a fate that none of them can escape. The journey from the golden gates of Asgard to the desolate shores of Lake Amsvartner was a silent one. The gods did not travel with the thunderous celebration that usually accompanied their expeditions. There was no blowing of horns, no singing of battle songs, and no boastful laughter. Instead, there was only the rhythmic creak of oars and the cold, biting wind of the north that seemed to carry the weight of an impending tragedy. They were moving toward a place of isolation, a jagged shard of an island called Lyngvi, located in the center of the pitch-black waters of Amsvartnir. It was a place where the sun's warmth felt like a distant memory, and where the very stones seemed to absorb the sound of hope. Fenrir followed them, though not as a prisoner. In his magnificent arrogance, he saw this journey as a final parade of his superiority. He moved through the water or leapt across the rocky crags with a grace that belied his mountainous size. He watched the gods with a look of predatory curiosity. He knew they carried something for him, a third challenge to replace the shattered iron of Lading and Dromi. He felt the weight of their fear, and it tasted like wine to him. He did not yet know of the silken ribbon hidden in its wooden casket, nor did he understand that the gods had finally abandoned the laws of the physical world in favor of the laws of paradox. Of all the deities present, only one stood near the wolf without the mask of feigned confidence. Tyr, the god of justice and single-minded courage, walked in the shadow of Fenrir's massive flank. He was the one who had sustained the wolf with meat during the long months of his growth in Asgard. He was the only one who had dared to look into those amber eyes and see a living being rather than a mere prophecy. Tyr was a figure of absolute stoicism, his presence as steady as the granite of the mountains. But on this day, his heart was a heavy stone. He knew that the bond between them, the bond of food and trust, was about to be used as a snare. He knew that the price of the world's safety would be paid in his own flesh. As they stepped onto the gray, salt-crusted earth of Lyngvi, the gods formed a wide circle. The air was still, and the only sound was the low, rhythmic lapping of the dark water against the shore. Odin, the All-Father, stepped forward. He held the wooden box in his hands as if it were a sacred relic. With a slow, deliberate movement, he opened the lid and pulled out Gleipnir. To Fenrir, the ribbon looked like nothing. It was thin, soft, and shimmered with a pale, ethereal light that seemed to shift between silver and gray. It looked more like a decorative garment for a bride than a leash for the son of Loki. The wolf let out a low, guttural growl that was half laugh and half threat. He looked at the gods, and his eyes burned with a cold, mocking fire. "Is this your third test?" Fenrir asked, his voice like the grinding of ice against a ship's hull. "You bring me a thread of silk after I have crushed your strongest iron. You insult the son of Angerboda with a toy. Do you truly believe that what lighting and Dromi could not do, this wisp of air will achieve?" The gods exchanged glances. They had anticipated his disdain. It was Skirnir, the clever messenger, who spoke first, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Fenrir, do not be deceived by appearances. You, of all beings, should know that strength is not always found in weight. This ribbon, Gleipnir, was forged by the masters of the deep earth. It is made of things you cannot see and cannot fight. If you are as strong as you claim, then this silk should be nothing more than a cobweb to you. But perhaps you are afraid. Perhaps you sense that there is a power here that your teeth cannot bite." Fenrir bristled, his charcoal fur standing on end like a forest of spears. The accusation of fear was a needle in his pride. He looked at the ribbon again, and this time he sensed the anomaly. His predatory instincts, honed in the dark shadows of the iron wood, began to scream. He smelled the cat's footfall. He felt the weight of the mountain's roots. He heard the silence of the fish's breath. He realized that this was not matter. It was magic. It was a cage built of things that did not exist in the physical realm. "I am not afraid of your string," Fenrir growled, his eyes narrowing to slits. "But I smell a trap. I sense a deception in the way you stand and the way you hold your breath. I will allow you to bind me with this ribbon, but only on one condition. I do not believe you will free me if my strength fails. Therefore, as a pledge of your good faith, one of you must place his right hand in my mouth. If the ribbon holds and you refuse to release me, then I shall have my payment." A sudden, suffocating silence fell over the island of Lyngvi. The gods, the immortal rulers of the 9 worlds, stood frozen. They looked at each other, and for the first time their collective cowardice was laid bare. Even Thor, the slayer of giants, looked away. Even Odin, who had sacrificed an eye for wisdom, remained still. They wanted the wolf bound, but they were not willing to pay the price. They wanted the safety of the world, but they wanted it for free. The wolf's amber eyes moved from god to god, his lips curling back to reveal teeth as long as swords. He began to laugh, a deep, resonant sound that mocked their divinity. "So," Fenrir taunted, "the masters of Asgard are silent. You want to test my strength, but you do not trust your own word. Perhaps you are the ones who are afraid." It was then that Tyr stepped forward. He did not speak to his kin, nor did he look at the All-Father for permission. He moved with a calm, unhurried grace toward the massive head of the wolf. He looked into Fenrir's eyes, and for a moment, the god and the beast were the only 2 beings in the universe. There was no hatred in Tyr's gaze, only a profound, tragic necessity. He understood that his honor as a god of justice was being sacrificed along with his flesh. He was the only one who could maintain the lie, because he was the only one who was willing to suffer the truth. Without a word, Tyr raised his right arm and placed his hand between the wolf's rows of jagged white teeth. He felt the warmth of Fenrir's breath and the razor-sharp pressure of the fangs against his skin. He did not flinch. He did not tremble. He stood as a pillar of stone in the center of the dark island. "Proceed," Tyr said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. The gods moved in with a frantic, desperate energy. They took the silken Gleipnir and began to wrap it around Fenrir's limbs and neck. The ribbon felt like nothing against the wolf's fur, yet as soon as the first loop was closed, the air on the island seemed to grow heavy. The runes of paradox began to glow with a soft, persistent violet light. The gods worked in silence, weaving the impossible ingredients around the predator. They fastened the final knot, and then they stepped back, their faces pale with a mixture of relief and horror. Fenrir felt the silk tighten. At first, it seemed like a joke. He flexed his muscles, expecting the ribbon to snap like a dry twig, but Gleipnir did not break. Instead, it grew stronger. The more the wolf struggled, the more the ribbon bit into his fur, turning into a bond as hard as diamond. He threw himself against the earth, his massive limbs working with a force that should have shattered the island of Lyngvi. He roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the 9 worlds, but the silken cord did not yield. It was a cage of shadows, and there was nothing for his teeth to bite. Fenrir realized the betrayal in an instant. He saw the gods beginning to smile, saw the way they started to laugh as they realized the trap had worked. He looked at Tyr, who was still standing with his hand in the wolf's mouth. Tyr did not laugh. He did not join the celebration of his kin. He looked at Fenrir with a sorrow that was deeper than the sea. The wolf's jaws snapped shut. The sound of the bone breaking was lost in the roar of Fenrir's fury. Tyr did not scream. He staggered back, clutching the stump of his arm, his blood staining the gray earth of the island. He had fulfilled his pledge. He had paid the price for the gods' deception. The wolf had his payment, but the gods had their prisoner. Fenrir's rage was a physical thing. He thrashed against Gleipnir, his eyes turning to fire. But the more he fought, the tighter the ribbon became. It was now a thin, glowing line that seemed to be part of his very skin. He was pinned to the earth, the mightiest creature in existence, brought low by a string of paradoxes. The gods took a heavy chain called Gelgia and attached it to Gleipnir, drawing the wolf toward a massive stone slab named Thviti. They drove a great rock, Gjöl, deep into the earth to serve as an anchor. The wolf's howls were unbearable. They were sounds of such raw, primal suffering that the earth itself seemed to weep. To silence him, the gods took a sword and thrust it into his open mouth, the hilt resting on his lower jaw and the point piercing his upper palate. Now his jaws were held wide, his tongue pinned by the cold iron. He could no longer howl. He could only growl, a low, rhythmic sound of eternal malice. From the wolf's mouth, a river began to flow. It was the Van, the river of expectation or hope. It was formed from the saliva and the venom of the bound beast, a dark, churning torrent that flowed from the island into the lake of Amsvartnir. It was a reminder that Fenrir was still alive, still dreaming of the end, and still waiting for the day his bonds would break. The gods looked at their work. They had achieved their goal. The prophecy had been delayed. The sun was safe for another age. But the cost was visible in the missing hand of Tyr and the broken honor of the Aesir. They had saved the world through a lie, and the wolf would never forget. They left the island of Lyngvi in silence, leaving Fenrir alone in the darkness, a prisoner of the impossible. Tyr walked among them, his cloak wrapped around his wound. He was now the one-handed god, the god who had sacrificed his physical wholeness for the sake of the cosmic order. He was a hero, yet he felt like a ghost. He knew that the victory was temporary. He knew that Gleipnir would hold for an eternity. But eternity in the eyes of a god is not the same as eternity in the eyes of fate. The wolf was bound, but he was not gone. He was the shadow beneath the world, growing stronger with every drop of the Van that flowed from his mouth. In the nights that followed, the atmosphere in Asgard was one of somber reflection. The laughter in Valhalla was muted. The gods had seen the limits of their power and the depths of their own desperation. They had bound the wolf, but they had also bound themselves to a future of fear. They knew that Fenrir would return. They knew that the sword in his mouth would one day be removed, and the jaws that had taken Tyr's hand would one day close around the All-Father. The island of Lyngvi remained a place of desolation. No bird would fly over it. No fish would swim near its shores. The wolf lay there, his fur matted with the salt of the lake and the blood of his struggle. He did not move, for movement only brought the bite of Gleipnir. He spent the centuries in a state of frozen malice, his mind focused on a singular point in the future, Ragnarok. He counted the heartbeats of the world, waiting for the moment when the iron of the sun would fail and the stars would fall from the sky. The story of the sacrifice of Tyr is the story of the high price of safety. It is the reminder that to contain chaos, order must often sacrifice its own purity. Tyr was the only one who understood that the wolf was not an external enemy, but a part of the universe that had to be reckoned with. By placing his hand in Fenrir's mouth, he was acknowledging the connection between the gods and the monsters. He was the bridge that was broken to save the shores. As we linger on the image of the bound wolf and the one-handed god, think of the silence of Lake Amsvartnir. Think of the river Van, flowing endlessly into the dark. It is the sound of a world that is holding its breath. It is the sound of an age that is waiting for the end. Fenrir is the prisoner of Gleipnir, but he is also the master of the weight. He is the shadow that will not go away, the wolf that is still growing in the dark. The gods rode back to Asgard, the ribbon having done what the iron could not. They had used the sounds of a cat and the roots of a mountain to leash the end of time. But as they looked back at the fading silhouette of Lyngvi, they felt the cold wind of the north growing sharper. The prophecy was not gone. It was merely resting. And the wolf, even in his silence, was still the son of Loki, still the heir of the iron wood, and still the one who would eventually devour the sun. This is the tragedy of the binding. It was a victory of cunning over strength, but it was also a victory of fear over honor. The Aesir had proven they were clever, but Fenrir had proven they were afraid. And in the long, dark winters to come, that fear would grow until it became the very fire that consumed them. The saga of Fenrir is moving toward its final, catastrophic conclusion, where the chains will break and the hunter will become the hunted. Let the night be still. Let the water of Lake Amsvartnir be black and deep. We are leaving the island of Lyngvi behind, but the memory of the wolf's roar remains in the air. The sacrifice of Tyr is complete, and the wolf is bound. But the end is always coming, and the wolf is patient. He has all the time in the world, for he is the one who will eventually end it. The echoes of the betrayal will linger in the halls of Asgard for eternity. Every time Tyr raises his stump of an arm, the gods will remember the cost of their safety. Every time the wind howls from the north, they will hear the growl of the bound wolf. They have bought themselves time, but they have paid for it with their souls. The story of Fenrir is the story of us all, the struggle to contain the darkness we have helped to create, and the realization that some shadows are too large to ever truly be leashed. The river Van flows on, a dark, bitter stream in a world of light. And the wolf waits, his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the first sign of the great winter. The silken bond is strong, but the hunger of the wolf is stronger. And one day the silk will snap, the sword will fall, and the jaws of Fenrir will open to swallow the world. The darkness that settled over the island of Lyngvi after the gods departed was not a natural night. It was a cold, thick, and metaphysical gloom that seemed to emanate from the bound wolf himself. For eons, Fenrir lay in the center of that desolate rock, pinned by the silken cord Gleipnir and anchored by the heavy stone Thviti. The sword remained wedged in his mouth, a cruel bridge of iron that kept his jaws eternally parted. He could not howl his fury to the stars, nor could he bite the chains that held him. He was a prisoner of the impossible, a titan of chaos reduced to a motionless monument of malice. But time, to a being of Fenrir's lineage, is a fluid and deceptive thing. He did not pass the centuries in a state of idle suffering. He passed them in a state of focused expectation. From his pinned mouth, the dark river Van continued to flow. It was a slow, churning torrent of saliva and venom, a liquid representation of the wolf's undying hatred. In the old tongue, Van means hope or expectation, a title that carries a deep, ironic weight. To the gods, the river was a reminder of their victory, a sign that the monster was contained. But to the wolf, the river was a countdown. Every drop that fell from his tongue was a second closer to the end. He was the master of the weight, a predator who understood that even the most golden of ages must eventually tarnish and fall. He watched the cycles of the world from his gray prison, his amber eyes never closing, his mind weaving a web of vengeance that spanned the 9 worlds. High above the island, the celestial chase continued. Skuld and Hati, the sons of Fenrir or his kin, depending on the whisperings of the poets, raced through the ether. They pursued the sun and the moon with a persistence that mirrored their father's own endurance. For thousands of years, the light held its ground, but the wolves were gaining. The distance between the predator and the prey was shrinking with every revolution of the world. Fenrir could feel the vibrations of their hunt in his very marrow. He felt the heat of the sun, Sol, as she fled across the sky, and he felt the cool, pale light of the moon, Mani, as he dodged the snapping jaws of Hati. He knew that their success would be the signal for his own liberation. The first signs of the end did not come from the sky, but from the hearts of men. This was the Fimbul winter, the great winter that would precede the fall of the gods. It was not merely a season of cold, but a 3-year span of moral and social collapse. The snow fell from all directions, driven by winds that bit into the soul. The sun gave no heat, and the moon was obscured by a constant, oppressive gray mist. In the realm of Midgard, the bonds of kinship snapped like dry twigs. Brothers fought brothers, and fathers turned against their sons. The world became a place of axes, of swords, and of shattered shields. The order that the Aesir had spent an eternity building was unraveling from the inside out. On the island of Lyngvi, the earth began to tremble. The tremors were not the result of tectonic shifts, but the rhythmic pulsing of Fenrir's heart. As the chaos in the worlds increased, so did the strength of the wolf. He felt the silken Gleipnir beginning to vibrate. The paradoxes that made up the ribbon, the cat's footfall, the mountain's roots, were losing their grip as the reality they were drawn from began to dissolve. When the world loses its logic, the bonds of paradox lose their power. Fenrir flexed his massive shoulders, and for the first time in an age, he felt the silk give way. The moment of the breaking was a sound that reached every corner of the cosmos. The ribbon Gleipnir, which had held through the age of gods, finally snapped. The stone Thviti shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the anchor Jol was ripped from the bedrock of the world. Fenrir stood up, his massive frame shaking off the dust and salt of his long captivity. He spat the sword from his mouth, the iron clattering against the stones like a discarded toy. He was free, and his hunger was a bottomless abyss. Fenrir did not walk. He became the storm. He moved toward the plains of Vigrid, the designated killing floor of the apocalypse. As he traveled, he grew. His lower jaw scraped the earth, tearing through mountains and forests as if they were nothing more than tall grass. His upper jaw reached the heavens, brushing the clouds and the stars. When he opened his mouth, he encompassed the entire horizon. He was no longer just a wolf. He was the maw of the universe, ready to swallow the light. Beside him, the other forces of chaos gathered. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, rose from the deep ocean, his venom staining the tides. The ship, Naglfar, made of the fingernails of dead men, sailed from the east, carrying an army of giants. Loki, free from his own chains, took the helm of the vessel, his eyes burning with the fire of his long-delayed revenge. The fire giant Surtur marched from the south, his flaming sword brighter than the sun, trailing a path of ash and smoke. The sky split open, and the stars fell like dying leaves. The gods of Asgard rode out to meet them. They were resplendent in their golden armor, their weapons gleaming with a light that was about to go out forever. Odin rode Sleipnir, his spear Gungnir held high, his blue cloak flowing behind him like a fragment of the sky they were trying to save. He did not look at the giants or the serpent. His gaze was fixed on the wolf. He knew that this was the final meeting, the one the Volva had whispered about in the dark. He knew that the father of the wolf would be the end of the All-Father. The plain of Vigrid was 100 leagues wide and 100 leagues long, yet it felt crowded as the two armies collided. The sound was a symphony of destruction, the clashing of steel, the roaring of monsters, and the screaming of the wind. Thor fought the serpent Jormungandr in a battle that shook the roots of the world. Freyr fell to the flaming blade of Surtur. Tyr, the one-handed god, fought the hound Garm, and both perished in the struggle. The age of the gods was being ground into the dust. Odin charged toward Fenrir. The wolf did not move. He simply waited, his jaws wide, a tunnel of darkness that led to the end of time. Odin thrust Gungnir with all the strength of the divine monarch, but the spear, which had never missed its mark, seemed to disappear into the vast emptiness of the wolf's throat. Fenrir lunged. In a single, violent motion, the jaws of the wolf closed around the All-Father. The wisdom of the runes, the memories of the Well of Mimir, and the glory of Valhalla were extinguished in an instant. Odin was gone. The heart of Asgard had been consumed. But the death of Odin was not the end of the story. From the chaos emerged a figure of silent, immovable power. This was Vidar, the son of Odin and the giantess Grid. He was the god of silence and revenge, a being who had spent his life preparing for this singular moment. He walked across the bloody earth of Vigrid, his presence a stark contrast to the roaring violence around him. He did not carry a spear or a hammer. He carried the weight of his father's legacy. Vidar approached the wolf, who was still gorged on the divine essence of the All-Father. Fenrir turned his amber eyes toward this new challenger, his mouth dripping with the blood of the king. He prepared to swallow Vidar as he had swallowed Odin, but Vidar was ready. He wore on his foot a shoe that had been crafted over the ages. It was made of all the scraps of leather that human shoemakers had discarded, the small, irregular pieces of the toes and heels. In the Norse tradition, these scraps were a tribute to the god of silence, a way for the common man to contribute to the defense of the world. As Fenrir opened his mouth to strike, Vidar stepped forward and planted his heavy, leather-clad foot onto the wolf's lower jaw. He reached up with his powerful hands and grasped the wolf's upper jaw. With a strength that was both physical and ancestral, Vidar began to pull. The muscles in his arms stood out like iron cables. The earth beneath his feet groaned as he applied the pressure of 1,000 winters. The sound of Fenrir's jaw breaking was the last sound of the old world. Vidar tore the wolf asunder, the great predator falling to the ground, his life force spilling out onto the plain of Vigrid. The shadow that had haunted Asgard for an eternity was finally extinguished. Fenrir, the son of Loki, the breaker of chains and the devourer of gods, was dead. But the victory of Vidar was a victory in a dying world. Surtur flung his fire across the 9 realms, and the flames consumed the palaces, the forests, and the meadows. The sea rose to swallow the burning earth, and the darkness of Ginnungagap returned to claim the wreckage. The age of the Aesir was over. The sun was gone, the moon was gone, and the stars were no more. However, in the silence of the void, the cycle began to turn once more. The earth rose a second time from the sea, fresh and green. The waterfalls began to flow, and the eagle flew over the mountain to hunt. The sons of Thor, Magni and Modi, emerged from the ruins, carrying Mjolnir between them. Vidar and Vali, the survivors of the final battle, walked the plains of Idavol, where the golden city had once stood. They found the golden chess pieces of the old gods in the tall grass, a reminder of the games they had played before the wolf arrived. And what of Fenrir? In the new world, his name became a story, a myth told around the hearths of a new generation of men. He was remembered as the great adversary, the shadow that defined the light. His legacy was not just one of destruction, but of the necessity of struggle. He was the reminder that even in a world of gods, there must be a place for the wild and the uncontrollable. He was the force that forced the gods to be more than they were, even if it led to their end. The saga of Fenrir is the saga of the inevitable. It is the story of the fear that we try to bind with iron and silk, only to find that the only thing that can truly face the darkness is the silent courage of the next generation. The wolf is gone, but the lesson remains. The chains of the world are fragile, and the shadows are always waiting. But as long as there are those like Vidar, those who prepare in silence and act with conviction, the new world will always rise from the ashes of the old. Listen to the wind as it moves through the trees. It is no longer the metallic clattering of the iron wood, but the soft rustle of a world that is beginning again. The river Van has dried up, and the island of Lyngvi has been swallowed by the sea. The wolf is at peace, and the gods are memories. But the thunder still rolls in the distance, a reminder that the storm is a part of the life of the world. Thank you for journeying with me through the complete life of Fenrir. From the dark mists of Yarnvid to the final fires of Vigrid, we have followed the path of the predator and seen the cost of the gods' safety. If you found peace in this deep dive into the shadows of the north, and if the story of the great wolf has helped you find your own quiet in the darkness, please leave a like and subscribe to Hearths of Myths. Let the ancient stories be your guide through the night, and may your dreams be as vast and deep as the worlds we have explored. The cycle continues. The sun will rise again, and the wolves will always be there, waiting at the edge of the light. But for now, let the silence be your blanket. Sleep well, and remember that even the longest winter eventually leads to spring. The saga of Fenrir is over, and the new world is waiting for you to wake up and see it. May your walls be strong, your heart be brave, and your sleep be deep and undisturbed. The shadows are at rest, and the stars are returning to the sky. Rest now, for the story is finished, and the night is yours.